There are moments in a life so small they make no sound at all. Not the slamming of a door, not the sharp crack of a verdict delivered in a crowded courtroom, not the particular silence that follows when a name is read aloud and found wanting by every person in the room who once considered it a friend. Smaller than any of those, a breath held behind a silk fan, a letter not burned when it should have been, a curtsy withheld where every rule of polite society demanded one be given. The night of the 23rd of March in the year 1814 held such a moment. A young woman named Verity Ainsworth stood at the foot of Lord Ashworth's ballroom staircase in a gown the colour of deep water, and when the Duke of Kincaid was presented to her by their mutual host, she did not curtsy. She held his gaze instead, deliberately, precisely for the space of 3 full heartbeats, and then turned and walked into the assembled company as though he were no one of particular consequence. The assembled guests did not gasp. They were too well bred for that. But what passed in the silence between a young woman's refusal and a duke's stillness was, in its quiet way, the hinge upon which everything turned. Verity Ainsworth had come to the season with a single purpose: to find the man who forged her father's name to a set of false ledgers, and to make him answer for it before she was too old and too worn down by 3 years of careful, unrewarded pursuit to try any longer. Theron Kincaid, Duke of Kincaid, attended every ball and supper and public occasion of the 1814 season with a single purpose of his own: to find the same man, the same name in different ledgers, the same hand behind 2 separate ruinations, each of them tidy, each of them complete. What neither of them knew on the night they failed to exchange a proper greeting was that the man they were each hunting was seated in the same room, behind a glass of claret, half hidden by the excellent architectural cover of a large potted palm, wearing the comfortable expression of a man who had never done anything one might call troubling. He had been watching them both for some time. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, the city, the hour, whether the window behind you is dark or lit. I read every single one. Verity accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman and positioned herself near the far wall of the ballroom, where the candlelight from the nearest chandelier thinned to shadow, and no one was likely to ask her to dance. She had nothing against dancing as a general principle. She had a considerable amount against the expenditure of goodwill and conversation it demanded, goodwill she preferred to reserve for more practical purposes. She was not without suitors. Her face, pale, angular, with the precise quality of a portrait rather than the warmth of a living person at rest, tended to make people look twice. Her gown was 4 seasons old and had been let out and re-hemmed by her own hands with a competence developed from necessity rather than preference. It passed without comment. She was not here to be courted. She was here because Lord Clement Foxcroft was reported to be in attendance tonight, and she had spent 8 months learning his habits, and she intended, before the evening was over, to add to that knowledge. She located him within 3 minutes of entering the room. Near the fireplace, broad-backed and amiably waited, moving through the assembled company with the ease of a man who had never encountered a social occasion he could not manage. He was laughing at something his companion had said. His laugh carried warmly across the room, open and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had never in his life done anything requiring concealment. Verity watched his hands. She had developed this habit over 3 years, watching hands rather than faces, which she had found to be more reliable. His were easy and still, a glass of claret balanced between 2 fingers with the relaxed authority of long practice. She noted the plain gold ring on his right hand, which she had not seen before. She noted that he did not glance once toward the door. She was watching Foxcroft when the Duke of Kincaid arrived. She knew his name. It had appeared twice in her notes in the past 18 months, once in a guild membership list from 1810, once in a set of letters she had persuaded a guild clerk to let her examine under the pretext of searching for her father's correspondence. She had not yet determined what the name meant in the context of what had been done. She had not determined whether it was connection or coincidence. She had intended, if the occasion arose, to find out. She had not anticipated that the occasion would arise at the foot of the main staircase. Lord Ashworth performed the introduction with the efficient warmth of a host who enjoyed his role. Miss Ainsworth, the Duke of Kincaid. Kincaid, Miss Verity Ainsworth, late of Northamptonshire, come to town for the season. He beamed at both of them and was already turning to the next introduction before she had to decide anything. She looked at the Duke. He was taller than she had expected, perhaps 30, with a bearing that added years and then took them back. His honey-brown eyes had the quality of eyes that notice things without advertising that they were noticing. He had begun to extend his hand. She did not curtsy. She held his gaze for exactly 3 heartbeats. She counted them because she counted everything now, and then she turned and walked into the crowd. She heard no exclamation behind her, no raised voice. She walked to her position at the far wall and took a sip of lemonade, and looked across the room and found, without difficulty, the Duke of Kincaid still standing where she had left him, watching her with an expression she could not read at this distance. She looked away. She returned her attention to Foxcroft. 10 minutes later, the air shifted in the way it shifted when someone approached her wall with intention. "Good evening," said the Duke of Kincaid. "We appear not to have been properly introduced." "No," she agreed without turning her head. "We appear not to have been." "I wondered," he said, "whether you might remedy that now." She considered it. Then she turned to look at him. "Verity Ainsworth," she said. "Theron Kincaid." A pause. "I know that you know that." "I know several things about you," she said. "Some of them I am still deciding what to do with." His expression underwent a slight adjustment, not quite a smile, not one. "There is a card room through there," he said. "If you were willing to speak somewhere quieter, I find myself—" He chose his next word with care. "Curious." She thought about saying no. She thought about what 3 years had taught her about the cost of excessive caution. "5 minutes," she said, and set her lemonade down on the nearest surface and walked toward the card room without looking back to see if he followed. She already knew that he would. The card room was quieter than the ballroom by degrees. Fewer candles, the music arriving through the walls as something muted and rhythmic, a pulse heard from another room entirely. It smelled of warm paper and the faint bitterness of card felt, and the particular staleness of rooms that were well maintained but seldom aired. A painting of a water spaniel hung above the mantelpiece, the dog depicted in a state of resigned melancholy that Verity found under the circumstances not without a certain sympathy. She turned to face the Duke of Kincaid. He closed the door behind him with care and stood with his back to it and his hands at his sides. A man who was angry occupied his hands. A man who was curious kept them still. She noted this. "I am curious," he said, "as to whether the oversight was an oversight." She could have apologized. She had constructed, in the 10 minutes between the foot of the staircase and this room, 2 perfectly serviceable accounts of distraction, one involving a momentary dizziness from the heat of the ballroom, one involving a conversation she had been mentally composing at an unfortunate moment. She used neither. "It was not an oversight," she said. He received this without visible reaction. "May I ask why?" Verity looked at the space between them. Perhaps 4 feet of turkey carpet, worn pale at its center from long use. She thought about what she was about to say, and about what saying it might set in motion, and about whether she had any choice she could honestly justify. "Because I was informed some months ago that your family name appeared in connection with the London Merchant Guild at the time of my father's trial. I have not been able to determine whether that connection was innocent." She met his eyes directly. "I do not curtsy to men I have reason to investigate." The music from the ballroom moved through the walls, something quick and cheerful, entirely oblivious to the conversation happening on the other side of the paneling. The Duke of Kincaid was quiet for a moment, long enough to be deliberate. "What was your father's name?" he said. His voice had changed, not in volume, not in the controlled steadiness of it. In texture, somewhere underneath. "Lord Arthur Ainsworth," she said. "Baron Ainsworth of Northamptonshire. He was accused of embezzlement from the guild accounts in the autumn of 1811. Tried, convicted on documentary evidence. His estate was settled against a portion of the claimed debt. He died at home 18 months after his conviction, in the spring of 1813. She said all of this in the same clear level register she had used to recount it to solicitors and guild officials and newspaper correspondents who had subsequently printed nothing. It still required each time a specific internal effort she hoped was not visible. He was innocent. Something moved behind the Duke's honey-brown eyes, not the polished impassivity she had expected. Something that shifted through his expression like a light relocated behind glass, a brief, bright illumination of something that had been waiting a long time for exactly these words to be spoken in exactly this order. "Sit down, Miss Ainsworth," he said quietly. "I would rather stand," she said. He accepted this with a slight inclination of his head, and then he told her about his uncle Marcus. He told it without decoration, in the same plain register she had used for her father's story, and she recognized in that choice, whether it was conscious or instinct, the particular respect of a person who understood that some things should not be softened. Marcus had been his mother's brother, a minor baron, a widower, a quiet man who had spent 30 years building a modest but honest reputation in trade, and had never, in all that time, given anyone reason to question his word. He had been accused of embezzlement from the guild accounts in the autumn of 1811. Verity felt the air change in the room. "The same set of accounts," she said. "Yes." "The autumn of 1811. "Yes?" He looked at her steadily. "He was convicted on documentary evidence. His handwriting, or what appeared to be his handwriting, on several key documents. I examined those documents afterward. The handwriting was convincing. It was not his." He paused. "He formed the letter G in a particular way I have never seen another person replicate. A small distinction, but I had 20 years of letters from him in which to observe it." She absorbed this. The spaniel above the mantelpiece observed the room with its expression of resigned awareness. "He died," she said. It was not quite a question. "In debtor's prison, the winter of 1811, 4 months after conviction. He had been in reasonable health." His voice did not alter. He was 53 years old. Verity thought about her father at breakfast, 3 months after his own conviction. The specific effort of sitting upright, the way the teacup seemed to require more concentration than it should, the particular careful arrangement of his face when she came in so that she would not be alarmed by what was happening underneath it. She had been alarmed regardless. She had simply not said so. She put the thought carefully aside. "Your name appeared in guild records," she said. "Twice. I found it in membership lists and in a set of correspondence from 1810. I had not determined whether the appearance indicated connection to what was done or whether it was entirely incidental. I attempted after Marcus died to petition for a review of his case," he said. 3 separate petitions, 3 separate refusals, all formally processed and formally denied. A pause. "After the 3rd, I began pursuing the matter through less formal means." She thought about what that meant. A duke with resources she did not have, 3 years, less formal means. "Foxcroft," she said. "Lord Clement Foxcroft, chairman of the Guild Accounts Committee in the autumn of 1811. She watched his face. "You have been watching him tonight. Not the card tables, not the women nearby. Him." Something in his expression resolved, like a hand finding a door it had been looking for in the dark. "He had a secretary," said the Duke, "a man named Dawes, who left his employ in the spring of 1812. "I know about Dawes," she said. He stopped. She looked at him directly. "I have a street, a borough. My information is 8 months old, and I have been debating whether approaching him alone is sensible." The Duke of Kincaid looked at her for a moment that had, she noticed, a different quality from the moments before it, as though what he was looking at had shifted from the category of what he had expected to the category of what was actually there. "It is not sensible," he said. "Alone." "No," she said. "I had concluded the same." The music outside slowed. Through the wall she could hear the faint percussion of 50 pairs of feet on polished wood, keeping time with something cheerful. "Thursday," he said. "I had been considering Thursday." "Friday would suit me better," she said. "Friday," he agreed. She moved to the door. He stepped aside. As she passed him, she caught the faint cedar scent of his coat, clean and dark. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, as she put her hand to the knob. She paused. "For what it is worth," he said, "I do not believe your father was guilty." She stood for a moment with her palm against the warm brass and the music pressing through the walls on both sides of her. "No," she said at last. "He was not." She opened the door, and walked back into the light. They did not speak again at the ball. They moved through the remaining hours of the evening on separate courses, she watching Foxcroft, who remained near the fireplace until 11 and departed without doing anything of interest. Theron at the card tables playing with the particular focused attention of someone who was doing something else entirely in his mind. When the carriages were brought round and the front hall filled with raps and murmured good nights, they did not acknowledge each other. Verity walked home. It was not far, 4 streets and a narrow turning, and the night was cold and dry and smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, and the walking helped in the way that it always helped, not by producing anything useful, simply by giving her body something to do while her mind worked. Mrs. Adelaide Maddox kept pace beside her in the tolerant silence that was one of the things Verity valued most about her aunt, the capacity to recognize when silence was the more useful form of company. "He is a very composed young man," said Mrs. Maddox when they turned into their street. "The Duke." "He is useful," said Verity. Her aunt made a sound that was capable of meaning several things and chose to mean nothing in particular. At home, Verity lit her single candle and sat at the small writing table by the window. She did not open the japanned box she kept under the loose floorboard behind the washstand. She did not need to. She knew every document in it and could have recited their contents in order. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the candle flame and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to think about what it would mean to succeed. She had kept this possibility in a tightly sealed compartment of her thinking for 3 years, accessible only as a specific form of incentive when the evidence was intractable or the officials were unhelpful. She had never permitted herself to consider success in its full dimension, what it would look like, what it would cost, what would remain, when the purpose that had been holding her upright for so long was no longer needed. She allowed herself to consider it now, for precisely the duration of the candle burning a 1/4 inch. Then she sealed it back up and went to bed. Theron Kincaid's note arrived the following morning. Formal and brief, worded with the care of a communication that must contain nothing remarkable and therefore did not. He was at her disposal at whatever hour was convenient if she wished to continue their discussion. He remained with sincere regards, etc. His handwriting was very precise and formed the letter G in an entirely conventional manner. She wrote back. She suggested the Tuesday following at a bookshop on Hanover Street that she had found useful for conversations of this variety, being respectable enough for a young woman to enter without remark, and sufficiently crowded with browsers to render a quiet exchange between 2 people near the natural history shelves effectively invisible. She gave the address and sent the note with the morning porter, and spent the interval until Tuesday in her usual occupations, reading the guild correspondence she had accumulated, maintaining her notes, writing 3 more letters to commercial registrars under various pretexts, and attending 2 social engagements at which Foxcroft was not present, and she learned nothing of use. The bookshop on Hanover Street occupied the ground floor of a narrow building that smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular sweetness of aged leather bindings, undercut by the damp that came from the cellar. It was run by a Mr. Hartman, who had been in the trade long enough to develop the expression of a man who found nothing unusual in any arrangement of customers, and consequently nothing unusual in anything. Mrs. Maddox settled near the front window with a volume of sermons. She favoured sermons in the way other women favoured novels, primarily for the plotting, and Verity moved to the back of the shop, to the natural history shelves, where the light came in at a low angle and the street noise from outside provided sufficient cover. She was genuinely reading about the migratory habits of the European starling when Theron Kincaid came in. She heard his footstep first, the deliberate, unhurried quality she had identified at the ball, and used the 30 seconds of his crossing the shop to finish her paragraph. She was not performing inattention. She was genuinely interested in the starling. He had brought a leather satchel, worn at the corners with long use. She had the japanned box. They settled at the shelf together with the slight, practiced discretion of 2 people who had each in their own way become skilled at not being observed. She laid out what she had. Her father's last 3 letters, which she had removed from his desk the morning after his death before the solicitors arrived. Copies she had made in her own hand of 3 documents she had been allowed to examine, but not to keep. a list of 12 names she had assembled over 8 months of careful inquiry, and a single unsigned note in unfamiliar handwriting dated October 1811, informing her father that if he spoke to anyone about the accounting discrepancy he had found, the consequences would be worse than public shame. She watched Theron read the unsigned note. His face did not change in the way faces changed when reading something expected. It changed in the way faces changed when something confirmed a direction of thought that had been building for a long time without yet having a name. From the satchel, he produced the Guild's draft accounts for 1811, not the official version, which was an artful and convincing lie, but a working draft obtained through a connection in the War Office who had owed him a considerable favor. He laid beside it a list of 12 transactions that appeared in the draft, but not in the official record, each one routed through an account registered to an entity called McDougall and Sons. Verity looked at the name. Then she looked at the dates. She had spent a long time with those dates. McDougall and Sons, she said, touching the entry with her gloved finger. This account appears 3 times in your list. 5 times in the draft, he said. The 2 additional entries were removed before the official accounts were produced. He leaned in slightly to read the line she was indicating, and she caught the cedar scent of his coat again, clean and dark in the dust and leather air of the shop. I could find no company by that name registered in London. There is one registered in Glasgow, she said. It ceased trading in 1809. She looked at the transaction date, 2 years before any of these entries were made in its name. He turned to look at her. His honey-brown eyes had, at their center, fine striations of amber that deepened toward the edge of the iris. She was aware of noticing this. She returned her attention to the documents. "You found that alone," he said. Not quite a question. "I wrote to commercial registrars in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Liverpool, Bristol, and 3 northern offices." She turned a page. "My aunt believed I was maintaining friendships from school. I appear, in retrospect, to have had an unusually dedicated social correspondence." She was not trying to be amusing. She was stating the situation. But she heard something change in his breathing, a small, quickly resolved alteration. And when she glanced up, she found him looking at her with an expression she was still learning to read. It was not the composed social surface he maintained in company. It was something underneath that surface, something that looked like a man who had grown accustomed to working alone in a long, quiet room and had just registered the fact of another person beside him and was not entirely sure what to make of the warmth of it. "Dawes," she said, returning to the shelf. "His full name is Marcus Dawes. He left Foxcroft's employ in March of 1812. My information places him in Spitalfields, but as I said, it is 8 months old." "He is still there," said Theron. "Above a tanner's yard on Newgate Lane he has not moved." "How do you know he has not moved?" "Because I had him watched for 6 months." A pause. "He does not go out much. He receives no visitors. He receives, as far as my man could determine, no correspondence." He looked at the unsigned note still lying on the shelf. "He is a frightened man, but I believe that he is tired of being frightened." Verity looked at the documents spread between them. The candlelight of the previous evening was replaced by the grey, flat light of a London afternoon, steady and without warmth, the kind of light that showed things plainly. "He kept something," she said. "Yes, I believe so." Something in Foxcroft's hand. A letter. Instructions. She looked at Theron directly. "A man who accepts payment for his silence, but keeps it for 3 years without asking for more money, is a man who kept something more valuable than the money. He kept it as a way out. In the event that the payment stopped or the danger grew larger than the silence was worth, he needed something to carry with him when he ran." Theron was quiet for a moment. Then he said in the particular tone of someone who has encountered an exact piece of reasoning and found it correct, "Yes, precisely." She looked at the window. Rain had finally decided to arrive and was making itself known against the glass. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he agreed. Spitalfields smelled of the tannery before they turned the last corner. A low animal, vaguely mineral smell that was not unpleasant once you stopped expecting it to be. The street was narrow, the buildings on either side pressing close enough to hold the smell in. A cat sat on a windowsill 3 floors up and watched their approach with the professional indifference of a creature with better things to consider. Mrs. Maddox had remained at Verity's lodgings with instructions, a pot of tea, and the expression of a woman choosing her battles with precision. Theron had sent a note ahead, not to Dawes, but to a man of his acquaintance in the neighbourhood, a former sergeant-at-law now turned merchant, who had confirmed that Dawes was in his rooms and had been there all morning. The note had not explained why this information was required. People, Verity had begun to observe, generally supplied Theron Kincaid with what he asked for without requiring a great deal of explanation. They climbed the stairs of a building that smelled of tallow and old wood, and the particular staleness of rooms that people lived in without much light. The tannery below gave a low, constant undertone to everything. On the second landing, Theron knocked. The door opened on a chain. An eye appeared in the gap, pale and wary as a coin seen at the bottom of a well. "Mr. Dawes," said Theron. A long silence. The eye moved from Theron's face to Verity's and back again. "You are the Duke of Kincaid," said the voice behind the door. It was flat, careful, the voice of a man who had been very still for a very long time and was not sure it was safe to move. "Yes," said Theron. Another silence. Then the chain came off and the door opened. Marcus Dawes was smaller than she had imagined. He was a slight man of perhaps 50, with the papery quality of someone who had spent years indoors and the eyes of a person who had been waiting for a particular knock for so long that the waiting had become its own kind of exhaustion. His room smelled of the tannery below and tallow candles and the faint sweetness of old bread. A single chair, a narrow bed, a box beneath it that she could see from where she stood, and that was, she noted, not quite pushed entirely under. He did not offer them seats. He stood near the window and folded his hands in front of him and looked at the floor. "I always thought it would be someone," he said, "sooner or later." "We are not here to harm you," said Theron. "No," said Dawes. "I know what you are here for." He looked up. His eyes this close had a quality that reminded her of her father in the last months, the quality of a person who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has begun to lose the distinction between the weight and themselves. "I told myself I would burn it. Every week for 3 years I told myself." "You did not burn it," said Verity. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, the recognition, she thought, of a particular kind of person, the kind who had also been waiting. "Whose daughter are you?" he said. She told him. She said her father's name and her father's title and what had happened to her father, and she said it in the same clear, level way she always said it, and Dawes listened with his hands still folded and his eyes on the floor, and when she finished he nodded once, a very small motion, as though something that had been in the wrong position for 3 years had just moved slightly back toward its proper place. "He didn't do it," said Dawes. "Neither of them did. I should have said so." "You were afraid," said Theron. "I was paid," said Dawes. "There is a difference. Being afraid is forgivable. Being paid is something else." He looked up at the Duke. "Your uncle, Marcus Kincaid. I am sorry." A muscle moved in Theron's jaw. It was the only outward evidence of anything. "Tell me about the letter," he said. Dawes bent and pulled the box from under the bed. It was a plain wooden thing, a little smaller than a hat box, with a cheap iron lock that he opened with a key on a chain around his neck. Inside, beneath a layer of household documents and a bundle of banknotes he did not touch, was a sheaf of papers tied with black cord. He untied them with care. 3 letters in Foxcroft's hand. Verity recognized the writing from examples she had obtained elsewhere, the broad, slightly forward-leaning script of a man who had always been confident of his own opinions. 2 of the letters were merely administrative. The third was 12 lines long. Theron took it and read it standing without moving, and she watched his face while he read, and saw nothing move in it except for the honey-brown eyes tracking down the page and back up to the signature at the bottom. He read it twice. Then he held it carefully, the way a person holds something fragile and irreplaceable, and looked at Dawes. "Instructions for the routing of guild funds through the McDougall & Sons account," he said, with specific reference to ensuring the transaction records aligned with the signatures of Lord Ainsworth and Baron Marcus Kincaid. His voice was even. "Dated 3 months before the accusation." "Yes," said Dawes. "Signed." "Yes." The tannery below gave its low, constant note. The cat was still on the windowsill across the street, watching. Verity looked at the letter in Theron's hands. 12 lines and a signature that had cost 2 men their lives and would cost a third man everything that remained. She thought about the unsigned note in her japanned box, the one that had threatened her father into silence 3 years ago. She thought about her father copying something at his desk, his hands shaking, 3 weeks before his death. She thought about what he had been trying to accomplish in those last weeks and had not managed, and about what it would mean that he had not needed to manage it alone. She brought her hands together in front of her and kept them still. The room smelled of tallow and the tannery below, and old bread, and the particular staleness of a life lived very quietly for a very long time. She thought, briefly and without warning, of her father's study. Its cedar sachets and dust and the low sound of the street outside, the quality of stillness in rooms where someone had chosen to stop moving through the world. Dawes had not chosen. He had been stopped. There was a difference, and she felt it in the room around her. "Mr. Dawes," said Theron, "I am going to make you a promise. You will be protected. Your evidence will be presented only in proper company before persons with the authority to act on it. If it becomes necessary for you to appear in person, I will ensure that you are accompanied by legal counsel at my expense. Foxcroft will not be able to reach you." He paused. "I do not make promises I am uncertain I can keep." Dawes looked at him for a long moment. He had the expression of a man calculating odds he had run many times before, but finding for the first time that some of the numbers had changed. "When?" he said. "A fortnight at most," said Theron. "I need to arrange the proper occasion." "A dinner," said Verity. Both men looked at her. "Foxcroft hosts a quarterly dinner for senior guild members. It is in 3 weeks. Sir Anthony Vane will be present. He is the current guild chairman. Lord Hargreave also attends, and he has jurisdiction over commerce questions through Chancery." She looked at Theron. "If we present the letter there before those witnesses, Foxcroft cannot quietly make it disappear. It becomes a matter of public record before he has time to manage it." The room was quiet. Dawes looked at the box in his hands, then back at Theron. "Keep them," said Dawes. He held out the papers. "I have been keeping them for 3 years, and I am tired of the wait. Keep them and do what you need to do." Theron took the papers with both hands. On the stairs going down, they did not speak. The tannery smell surrounded them, familiar now, almost like company. Each step creaked in its own specific register, a sound she would associate, she thought, for a long time with this afternoon. Outside, the street was grey and cold, and the cat on the windowsill had gone inside. Verity stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed the cold air which smelled of the tannery and the mud of the street, and somewhere beneath both of them the faint river smell that undercut all of London when the wind came from the right direction. She felt the weight of what had just happened settling into a shape she could recognize. Not relief yet. 3 weeks was still 3 weeks, and she had learned not to mistake proximity for arrival. But something had shifted. They had the letter. They had Dawes. The outline of what had been done to her father existed now in physical form, in Theron's satchel, with his signature on 12 lines. That was real, in a way that the knowledge of it had not been, for 3 years, quite been. "That is the letter," she said. "Yes," said Theron. She nodded. She would not allow herself anything larger than that. Not yet. 3 weeks was still 3 weeks. The note appeared on the Saturday, slipped under the door of her rented room sometime between 9 in the evening and midnight, when she returned from a supper engagement at Lady Harrington's. It was folded once and had no seal. She picked it up from the floor and turned it over in her hands before she opened it. She had learned over 3 years to handle unexpected letters carefully. It read, "The matter you are pursuing is not yours to pursue. Those who have persisted in examining what was settled in a court of law have found the experience detrimental to their health and circumstances. Consider yourself informed. Conduct yourself accordingly." No signature. The handwriting was neat in the deliberate way that required considerable effort to achieve, the neatness of someone disguising their natural hand rather than expressing it. She read it twice, then she set it on the table. Her candle had burned a third of the way down. The coal in the small grate had gone to ash. The room was cold in the way rooms get cold when they have been empty for several hours, a thorough, settled cold that takes time to shift. She sat in the chair by the grate and looked at the note and thought. And someone had told Foxcroft they were investigating. Not necessarily what they had found. The note's language was careful, not specific. He knew they were looking, but she did not think, from the measured tone of the warning, that he yet knew about doors. If he had known about doors, the note would have been different, more specific, or not a note at all. She thought about Theron, and about the letter in Theron's possession, and about 3 weeks. She did not burn the note. She put it in the japanned box with the other documents and extinguished the candle, and sat in the dark for several minutes. The coal smell of the dead grate, the faint sound of a cart in the street below, very late and unhurried. The tip of her finger where she had touched the snuffer was warm for a while, and then it wasn't. She thought about her father in his study, in the last weeks. The specific effort of his face arranged into something that would not alarm her when she came in. She wrote a note and called for the night porter. Theron arrived at midnight. Mrs. Maddox opened the door in her wrapper and nightcap and took one considered look at the Duke of Kincaid on the doorstep. Then she took herself to the kitchen and closed the door with the firmness of a woman who had made a practical decision and intended to maintain it. The hallway was lit by a single candle on the side table. The draught from the street door guttered the flame. Theron read the note standing, and she watched him in the same way she watched Dawes and Foxcroft and everyone else who came into the space of this investigation for the first unguarded movement, the thing that preceded the decision about what to show. He set the note down. His face had the quality it got when he was containing something. Very still, the way still water is still, not absent of movement, but holding it. "This changes the plan," he said. "No," she said. He looked up. "It does not change anything," she said. "We go to the dinner. We present the letter. If we withdraw now, we give him exactly what he wants, simply by remaining where we are long enough." She folded her arms. "He does not know what we have. He is warning us away from what he thinks we are looking for, which is something less. We are already past that. Verity," her name in his voice with that particular deliberate weight, "if something happened to you because I did not insist on greater caution—" "Nothing is going to happen to me," she said, "and if it did, it would be the consequence of my own choice, not yours." He looked at her for a moment that was long enough to contain several things. She looked back at him and did not move. The candle flame settled. "I am going to double the men watching doors," he said, "and I would like to know that you have someone in this building who can be trusted." "Mrs. Maddox's nephew," she said. "He is large and he is loyal, and he is between positions at present. He can stay in the hall." "Good." He paused. "The dinner is in a fortnight." "Yes. Between now and then, no contact with the guild and no further inquiry that might alert Foxcroft to what we have." He picked up his hat from the side table. "We have the letter. We have doors. We wait, and we are careful, and in a fortnight it is finished." She looked at him in the candle-lit hallway, this man who had spent 3 years on the same road she had, and thought about the word finished and what it would feel like to say it and mean it. "Yes," she said. "Finished." He left. She stood in the hallway after the street door closed and pressed her hands open against her skirts and made herself breathe, slowly and deliberately, until the tightness behind her ribs had reduced to something manageable. The night was very quiet. The candle burned steadily now, no draught. She went back to bed and, for the first time in a week, slept. The invitation had come through Sir Anthony Vane, who was the current chairman of the London Merchant Guild, and a man with whom Theron had maintained a professional acquaintance of the kind built on mutual utility and occasional, carefully limited trust. Theron had requested the connection with the quiet assurance of someone who understood what he was asking for and what it would cost. Sir Anthony had extended it without requiring an explanation, which Verity took as evidence that he was either an exceptionally trusting man or a man who had himself observed over time something in Foxcroft's management of guild affairs that he had not known how to address. Verity had come as Theron's guest. This arrangement had produced a small, predictable flurry of commentary in the hallway of Foxcroft House when they arrived, most of it confined to raised eyebrows and the kind of whispered observation that evaporated before it reached anyone of consequence. Mrs. Maddox had come as well, seated now at the far end of the dining table, with the composed expression of a woman who had attended many dinners under unusual circumstances and had developed an excellent facility for observing without appearing to. The dining room at Foxcroft House was large and warm and beautifully lit, the kind of room designed with care to make its occupants feel comfortable in ways that primarily served the host. The candelabra were good silver. The flowers were winter jasmine, slightly too sweet in a closed room. The portraits on the walls showed 4 generations of Foxcrofts, each one painted in an attitude of comfortable authority, as though comfort and authority had always arrived together in that family, without requiring any particular effort. Foxcroft himself moved through the room as he moved through every room she had observed him in, with the ease of a man who understood his own terrain. He was 58, florid, carrying his weight with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had never in his life been made to feel it was a disadvantage. He shook her hand when they were introduced with warm, practiced cordiality, and looked at her with the benign, assessing glance of a man who placed women in one of 2 categories and was determining which. He smelled when he leaned in to say something friendly about the weather, of tobacco and beeswax, and something underneath both she could not name. Something that reminded her faintly of courtrooms. She smiled. She smiled precisely as much as the occasion required, and no more. She was seated between Sir Anthony Vane and a guild secretary, whose name she learned and immediately lost. Theron was across the table and 3 places to her left. She did not look at him directly. She knew, without needing to confirm it, that he was not looking at her directly either. They had agreed 3 days earlier over a brief exchange of notes that this was the correct approach. The evening required them to appear unconnected, to give Foxcroft nothing to watch. She ate the soup, a cream of parsnip, generously spiced, slightly over-salted in a way that was nonetheless comforting. She listened to the conversation around her and contributed to it with the measured warmth she had learned to deploy in social situations that required her full attention elsewhere. She heard Foxcroft tell 2 anecdotes about parliamentary figures, both gently amusing, both requiring the listener to find parliamentary figures inherently comic, both delivered with the timing of a man who had told them before and knew where the laughter would fall. She laughed at the appropriate moment, which was the same moment as everyone else, and looked at the surface of her soup. Under the table, the edge of her reticule pressed against her knee. Inside it, the letter and the relevant pages of the draft accounts and Dawes's written statement, prepared 3 days ago with the assistance of Theron's solicitor and signed in the presence of 2 witnesses. Copies existed in 3 separate locations. She had been very careful about this. Theron had the originals. She had confirmed this that afternoon in 4 words exchanged on the pavement outside the bookshop, where they had agreed to pass each other at exactly 3:15. She felt the reticule against her knee and ate her soup. The second course was a roasted saddle of lamb with winter vegetables and a sauce of reduced wine. She ate it with the attention it deserved, which was genuine. Foxcroft's cook was excellent. Lord Hargreave, at the far end of the table, was describing a case he had recently decided involving a disputed inheritance, and the guild secretary on her left was listening with the carefully constructed interest of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Sir Anthony Vane, at her other side, was quietly watching Foxcroft in a way Verity recognized. Not the watching of suspicion, exactly. The watching of a man who had noticed something he could not yet articulate. Dessert arrived, a pear tart that smelled of cinnamon and caramelized sugar, and was very good. She ate it and allowed herself to think about her father. Not the tightly controlled, rationed version of him she kept for moments when she needed to remain functional, but the fuller version, his voice at dinner, which had always risen half a note when something amused him, the specific way he laughed, starting in his chest and arriving a moment later on his face. The smell of his study, old paper and candle wax, and the cedar sachets her mother had put in the bookshelf before Verity was born, and which had stayed there ever since, fading imperceptibly through all the years she could remember. She held all of this and let it be what it was, and then she set it down. The port was brought. The convention of the evening required the ladies to retire. She set her port glass down and looked, for the first time in the entire meal, directly across the table at Theron. He gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod. "Lord Foxcroft," she said. Her voice was pleasant and entirely without tremor. The conversation at the table reduced itself in the way conversations reduced when someone of no particular authority introduced a note of unexpected intention. "Before we leave the table, I wonder if I might raise a matter of business. I believe it will be of interest to Sir Anthony and to Lord Hargreave." Foxcroft's face did not change immediately. She noted this. The delay before any shift was visible, the 3 full seconds in which a man who had spent 30 years managing his expressions allowed the machinery of those years to operate before anything showed. It showed at last as a tightening at the outer corner of his left eye and a very slight adjustment of his shoulders that he caught and reversed before it completed itself. "How charming," he said. "A lady with a business concern, by all means." She placed the documents on the table beside her dessert plate. Carefully, without haste. She had spent 3 days rehearsing this, not the words, which would take care of themselves, but the hands. The steadiness of her hands. "These are pages from the London Merchant Guild's draft accounts for 1811, she said to the table. "And this is a letter bearing Lord Foxcroft's signature, which was retained by a former member of his household and has remained in safekeeping for 3 years. The silence at the table was a different quality of silence than the silences that had come before it. Not the natural pause between courses, not the brief quiet of a story ending. The silence of people who understood that what they were witnessing could not be undone. Sir Anthony Vane leaned forward. Lord Hargreave set his port-glass down. Foxcroft laughed. It was an excellent laugh, warm, dismissive, the sound of a man encountering a charming absurdity. "My dear Miss Ainsworth, the letter," said Theron Kincaid from across the table, in a voice that was quiet and perfectly level, "details specific instructions for the routing of guild funds through a dormant commercial account in Glasgow and for the arrangement of documentary evidence to place responsibility for the fraud with 2 other guild members." He did not look at Foxcroft as he said this, which Verity understood immediately as deliberate. He looked at Lord Hargreave. "One of those members was my uncle, the Baron Marcus Kincaid, who died in a debtor's prison in December of 1811. The other was Lord Arthur Ainsworth, Baron of Northamptonshire, who died at home in the spring of 1813, 18 months after his public conviction." A very brief pause. "Miss Ainsworth is his daughter." The table was completely still. The jasmine on the sideboard was slightly too sweet in the warm room. The candelabra threw their long, steady light up the white walls and across the faces of 4 generations of Foxcrofts in their painted attitudes of comfortable authority. "This is an extraordinary claim," said Foxcroft. The laugh had left his voice. What remained was smooth and careful and did not quite sound like him at all, which was, Verity thought, the most revealing thing about it. "An unsigned document and a letter that could have been produced by anyone." "The letter is signed," she said. She passed the original without looking away from Foxcroft's face to Sir Anthony on her left, who passed it without comment to Lord Hargreave. "And the person who kept it is prepared to give sworn testimony before Lord Hargreave tonight, if that is what is required. He is outside." Lord Hargreave was reading the letter. He turned it over, examined the signature, turned it back. He was a man of 60, with the expression of someone who had spent 4 decades in Chancery and had developed a face that gave away almost nothing. But she watched him look at the signature for a long time and then set the letter down. And she knew. Sir Anthony Vane placed both hands flat on the table, a very still gesture, and looked at the man at the head of his own table. "Clement," he said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone choosing between several things to say and selecting the shortest. "Is that your hand?" Foxcroft looked at Vane. He looked at Lord Hargreave. He looked at the letter in front of Hargreave, which he could see from where he sat but could not retrieve without crossing the length of the table. His expression had undergone in the past 2 minutes a complete transformation. Not dramatic, not a crumbling, but the withdrawal of a surface that had been maintained by sustained effort, and the appearance of what had been beneath it all along. Something flat and calculating and very old. He did not look at Verity. "I should like," he said slowly and deliberately, "to speak with my solicitor before I say anything further." Verity heard the words and understood in the moment of hearing them that they were the words of a man who had run out of the particular kind of room in which he was most capable. Not a confession, something more final than a denial. The request for a solicitor in this room, before these witnesses, with this letter on the table, was its own kind of answer. She sat very still and felt a weight begin to shift in her chest. Not the sudden release she might have imagined in earlier years, when she had allowed herself to imagine this moment. Something quieter and more substantial than that. The weight settling into its new position, which was not on her. Across the table, Theron met her eyes. She had looked at him briefly at intervals through the evening, without letting the looks mean anything that might be visible to Foxcroft. This was different. This was a full look, held, with nothing required of it, except itself. His face had the expression of a man who has been holding something at considerable physical cost for a very long time, and whose arms have for the first time been permitted to rest. "I think," said Lord Hargreave, setting his port-glass aside with the precise movement of a man organizing his evening around something other than what he had planned for it, "that we should all remain." Sir Anthony Vane had by this point the expression of a man who had suspected something for a long time, and was experiencing the particular variety of relief that comes with finding out the thing you suspected was not imaginary. He did not speak. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on Lord Hargreave and waited, which Verity thought spoke well of him. Foxcroft's solicitor was sent for. Dawes was brought in from the cold of the street, where he had been waiting with Theron's man since 7:30. He entered the dining room and confirmed, in the measured voice of a man who had made a decision and intended to stand by it regardless of what it cost, everything the documents contained. He identified the letter. He explained its contents. He answered Lord Hargreave's questions for 40 minutes, with a steady, papery clarity that Verity thought must have cost him more than it appeared. She did not watch Foxcroft while this was happening. She had watched him enough. She watched Dawes instead. Outside afterward, the air was cold enough to feel like a clear thing, after the warmth and jasmine of the dining room, cold and coal-scented and damp, the streets dark and wet from a rain that had come and gone while they were inside. The fog was moving in off the river in long, slow banks, turning the gas lamps into blurred amber shapes against the dark. Mrs. Adelaide Maddox had been seen into a hackney by a young footman who had read her expression correctly and had departed. Verity stood on the pavement outside Foxcroft House. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them in the amber fog light and found this fact curious, as though her body had waited for the appropriate moment to do the thing it had been too occupied to do before, and had now chosen this one. She pressed her palms against the fabric of her coat and breathed the cold, wet air. Theron came to stand beside her, not close enough for contact. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold, which was not the same thing, and was, precisely then, what she needed. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at the fog, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for 3 years. The tightness had been so constant and so complete that she had ceased to perceive it as an abnormality, in the way one ceases to perceive a sound that is always present. Its loosening had a shape. It moved like a letter being unsealed. She thought about her father at his desk, copying names with shaking hands. She thought about the unsigned note, the one that had warned him into silence. She thought about what he had been attempting, alone, in those last weeks, and had not managed. He had managed it. She had managed it for him. It was the same thing, and it was not the same thing. And she stood in the cold and felt both of these truths at once, and let them be true together. "Theron," she said. He turned. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for the staircase. I was told your name was connected to the guild, and I did not determine what the connection was before I acted on the assumption." "You were investigating," he said. "You were following what you had." I was unkind. "Miss Ainsworth," he paused. "Verity." Her name with that particular careful weight. "You spent 3 years doing something very difficult entirely alone. Do not apologize to me for the manner in which you survived it." She did not close her eyes. She looked at the fog instead, the slow amber shapes of it moving above the wet stone of the street, and felt the cold against her face, and heard, far off, the bell on the river beginning to count the hour. "Your uncle," she said. "He will be vindicated as well. The review will happen now." "Yes," he said. "I know." A pause. "Thank you." She looked at him. He was looking back at her in the foglight, with an expression she had been learning incrementally since the night of the Ashworth ball, and had not yet finished learning. It was not the controlled, polished surface he maintained in public. It was the thing under that surface which was patient and attentive, and had, she thought, been pointed in her direction for some time now, waiting for her to notice. "I would like," he said, with the careful deliberateness she had come to understand, was how he spoke when he was saying something that mattered, "to have occasion to speak with you beyond this, if you would be willing." "In what capacity?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the amber fog, in the wet cold of the street, with the river bell counting somewhere behind them and the lamps burning their blurred light above. "Something," he said, "considerably better than investigative associates." She thought about the bookshop on Hanover Street, and the geological surveys, and the way he had read the unsigned note in her hallway, with his hands entirely still. She thought about 3 years and what they had cost, and what it had felt like in Spitalfields when he had taken her father's vindication into his hands with such care. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." He did not reach for her hand. He did not move closer. He simply looked at her with an expression she thought she would spend a considerable amount of time learning to read, and she looked back at him, and the fog moved around them, and the bell on the river finished counting, the shadows where romance lives. Many months later, after the legal proceedings that returned the Ainsworth name to the Guild records in its proper standing, after the review that vindicated Marcus Kincaid and restored what could be restored to his remaining family, after the letters exchanged and the afternoon spent in the bookshop on Hanover Street, for reasons that had nothing to do with documents, after the gradual and careful and mutually attentive process of learning another person, in the way that people learn each other when they have both been careful for a long time and are not inclined to stop simply because a particular investigation has concluded, Verity Ainsworth sat at a small writing desk in a house she was beginning to think of as home, and wrote a letter she had been composing, in various forms, for 3 years. She addressed it in the firm, clear hand of a woman who had decided that clarity was a form of love. "Dear Papa, I should have written this letter long ago. I did not because I did not know until recently how to bring it to an ending that was true. I can tell you now that your name stands clear. The record has been corrected and the correction stands. The man who took from you your reputation, your peace, and in the end your health, has answered for it before the people who had the authority to make that answer count. Your signature was not on those documents. Every person whose word carries weight in this matter has been told so in writing, under oath. I should also tell you that in the course of finding this out, I met a man I think you would have liked. He is not easily known quickly, but he is worth knowing slowly. He has honey brown eyes and a very precise way of using my name when he requires my full attention, which I find more often than I expected I am entirely willing to give. He tells me that his uncle, who died 3 years ago in a debtor's prison because of the same man, was a quiet and honest person who had spent his life building something small and good and his own. I think his uncle and you might have been friends. He asked me once what you were like. I told him that you were honest to the point that it occasionally inconvenienced you, and that you found most things funnier than other people expected. He said that explained a great deal about me. I think in the best possible way it did. I am well, Papa. I am warm, and I am not afraid, and I have, at last, set something down that I did not know, until I set it down, how much I had been carrying. I believe you would have approved. I remain always your Verity, where every gesture is a poem,